Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. The United States says that South Africa's genocide submission against Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice has no merit. At the same time, Tel Aviv has vowed to defend its offensive on the enclave when the Hague court sits for the matter late next week. Over 22,000 Palestinians have died in the conflict, which is now in its 90th day. It follows a surprise attack on southern Israel by Hamas fighters in early October, which claimed nearly 1,200 lives. International relations expert Brooks Spector joins us for more analysis. Brooks, a pleasure to have you on the program this evening. Now, the Israeli government has vowed or says it will oppose South Africa's application at the International Court of Justice, while Pretoria wants a preliminary order to stop Israel's military action in Gaza as part of its application, which implicates Tel Aviv in alleged genocide against Palestinians. Give us some perspective on what you make of this.
Well, what I make of this is the petition by the South African government is asking the International Court of Justice not to be confused with the International Criminal Court. The International Court of Justice was set up decades before the UN, although it's now subsumed within the UN architecture.
Yeah.
The petition claims genocidal intent, and I went and looked up the Genocide Convention of 1951, and if I could, I'll read one sentence from it. Article 2 says, in the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And I think the problem, the challenge, the difficulty, the hill to climb for the South African petitioners is going to be to prove that killing people in the process of military action is by itself and by definition meeting the terms of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And I think that's a fairly heavy lift that they're going to have to make. And remember, too, that genocide, by its very nature, by the word itself, originally arose out of World War II after the realization of the extent of the Holocaust during World War II by Nazi Germany. The combat in Gaza, with admittedly 22,000 plus people who have died, death is a terrible thing, and 22,000 plus people having died is 22,000 dead people, and that's even more terrible than one person, of course. But does it meet the terms and conditions of genocidal intent? I would be unconvinced of that. In fact, I would have thought that a different approach, perhaps one to the International Criminal Court, might have been more appropriate, because the South Africans could have, I think, charged crimes against the law of war and made that more likely to stick. Now, of course, you can't make that charge against a nation that is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and I believe Israel has never ratified the treaty, so that might be moot. But one of the problems that comes out of this is that although South Africa can make its petition, and let's just for the sake of argument determine that the justices there agree, what enforcement mechanism exists? Under current circumstances, moral suasion is really the only thing that applies. They can ask the UN to impose one or another types of actions, such as sanctions or other kinds of punishment, but no rational person is going to assume that the UN is going to vote to send a military intervention to prevent the Israelis from continuing their action in Gaza.
So in light of the recent developments, including the ICJ's decision to hold these public hearings on South Africa's case against Israel, what potential legal implications do you foresee for Israel's actions in the Gaza-Israel war, particularly concerning the plan for Palestinian resettlement?
Well, that plan was announced or argued or proposed by two of the more extreme religious right-wing zealots in the cabinet. And the Israeli defense minister has said that is not the government's plan. So, there's obviously a certain disharmony within the Israeli cabinet, and Prime Minister Netanyahu is in a enormously difficult set of circumstances himself. I don't foresee any sort of idea coming to fruition of a mass resettlement or relocation of people from Gaza, despite the minister in question having said that was his hope, his intent, because the government clearly hasn't taken that decision. But let's move beyond that and say, what is the effect going to be on South Africa's standing with other nations with which it has relations? And I'm thinking in particular with its relations with the United States and with most Western European and a number of other nations. And I think it's fair to say that it's not going to be considered to be a positive step. In fact, I've coined the phrase performative politics or performative international relations. This is a demonstration of a feeling by the South African government rather than a practical method or a reasonable and realistic idea of doing something to end the fighting, to stopping the carnage, and to somehow moving in the direction of settlement if such a thing can be achieved. Now, South Africa will gain support from a number of countries, quite obviously, but it's certainly not going to gain the support of Western nations as a general feeling. And I'm not even sure that the Russians will be entirely disposed to this, because it opens up their own set of circumstances vis-a-vis Ukraine in their current invasion.
So the humanitarian impact on the conflict is quite stark, with the reported 1 million people displaced in Rafah alone. How can the international community then effectively address the immediate needs of those who are displaced, and what role do major powers like the U.S. play in also facilitating a resolution to this crisis?
Well, I mean, part of let's sort of divide it into various kinds of things. One thing that the international community, and most especially the U.S., because that country is obviously the prime supporter and backer of the Israelis, is to continue to exercise increasing pressure on Israel to restrain its activities, to limit its use of military force. Whether that will be sufficient to make the Israelis do it or not is a different kind of question. Second part of this is to put increasing pressure on Israel to allow additional aid, relief, and support to all of those people which is obviously a very large number of people who have been pushed from pillar to post in Gaza in the last 90 days, and who are now virtually entirely dependent on relief from outside international agencies. But at the same time, there has to be, in some way, shape, or form, pressure brought to bear on Hamas to end its own actions. Remember, there are still rockets being fired from some part of Gaza aimed at various Israeli cities, not effectively and not successfully for the most part, but still being launched over the last number of days and weeks as well. So let me just move to another point, which is one of the things that I worry about most, and I think most people should, is the way in which this conflict in Gaza between the Israelis and Hamas, and the sad side effect of all the other people in Gaza being made internally displaced individuals, is the way in which groups like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon may in fact try, as they seem to be in giving some indications, that they would like to extend the conflict. And some Israelis, of course, are saying something of the same kind of thing. And the fact that a Hamas commander or deputy commander was killed by presumably Israeli forces the other day doesn't give me all that much hope that this tension is unwinding rather than continuing to ratchet up.
But in contrast, there have also been a number of reports that have emerged of the Israeli army's continued attacks on Lebanese territory and also Hezbollah's strong stance. How do you assess the risk of the conflict expanding beyond Gaza and Israel? And what diplomatic measures could be taken to prevent a further escalation in the region?
I'm always of the opinion that in a conflict zone, it takes an unforeseen event. Let me draw a parallel. All it would take in the South China Sea to bring China and the United States into something approaching the possibilities of conflict would be for two fighter pilots to decide to be a little more aggressive than they have been so far, and for one plane to be shot down or sufficiently harmed that it crashes. That would be terrible. One of the things, now going back to the Middle East where we started our discussion, all it would take at this point, I think, would be for a few minutes even of an all-out effort by Hezbollah to shell Israeli settlements that are close to the border, or for the Israeli Defense Force to engage in actions against the Hezbollah forces in southern Lebanon that significantly affect Lebanese rather than the Hezbollah fighters. In other words, when you're in a situation like this, it doesn't take all that much to break the stalemate in a very bad way.
There have also been other developments, such as the resignation of U.S. Education Department Policy Advisor, that's Tariq Abash, in protest of President Joe Biden's approach, also raising questions about the international community's response. How might the Biden administration's stance impact the trajectory of the conflict? And what diplomatic strategies could be employed to encourage a permanent ceasefire?
Well, I mean, let's take at face value the resignation of an official within the Education Department. The individual concerned, of course, had no involvement on foreign policy or strategic affairs, but as a personal matter, he felt compelled to make his position known. There have been a couple of other individuals who have done the same for personal reasons, and personal reasons related to the specifics of policy in the Middle East. At this point, they have chosen to resign, or several hundred people signed a letter asking the president to alter his positions to some degree. Now, one of the things that one should understand is that, with hundreds of thousands of officials within the U.S. government, there are almost inevitably going to be some people who disagree with any policy choice on domestic or international areas. It's up to individuals to decide whether they can continue to serve in a government whose policies they disagree with. And people will, as it happens over time, occasionally do that. The man in question obviously had strong feelings and thoughtful reasoning, and he agonized for some months before he made his choice. What you do see is that the Biden administration is beginning to inch away. I mean, I don't want to say move away because it's very incremental at this point, to move away from that initial response after the October 7 invasion, in which it was essentially the United States has your back, saying it to Israel without question, without any equivocation. The Biden administration is beginning to push harder on those two things that we started our conversation with. One, in the manner in which military action is continuing to be carried out, and the way in which relief supplies and is allowed to proceed. But let's be honest. The Biden administration is not going to suddenly wake up tomorrow morning and say we've changed our minds. We no longer support the Israelis, and that's that. That's not going to happen. And I don't think you'll see that from the British or from a significant number of Western European nations as well. So you're left. We come right back to the initial prognosis, which is there is going to be more of a push to manage downward the military action and manage upward the relief action. That leaves the question, which is the big one really, how do you move away from these temporizing issues to a settlement? And that is one of these things which has obviously eluded people for, 70 years? There have been a number of agreements, the Oslo Accords, the Camp David Accord, the Abraham Accord, which have done some things, but the overall larger strategic accord that embraces all of the difficult questions still seems out of reach, in part because the biggest question is the status, not Gaza, but the status of the West Bank, where most Palestinians reside, and which is currently under a mix of Israeli occupation, indirect rule, and Palestinian authority rule. It's a big patchwork of these things, and that is the big stumbling ground. Gaza is, unfortunately, something of a side issue in that respect.
That concludes an insightful conversation with international relations expert Brooks Spector on the complex and pressing issue of the Gaza-Israel war, and the multifaceted challenges and global implications have really brought to light the ongoing developments from legal proceedings at the International Court of Justice to the diplomatic efforts and the humanitarian crisis, underscoring the urgency of finding a sustainable resolution to this particular conflict.